A big concept that's tackled throughout Gurren Lagann is oppression. From the minute examples of it in the small underground villages throughout the world that we witness in the introductory episodes, to the universe-wide adversity that the anti-spirals represent, humanity is constantly being subjugated. The nature of this need to control humanity may have seemed justified to those in power, but regardless of the reasoning behind these acts, oppression and the consequences of it are an ever-present element in the story, both during and in generations prior to the time span of the show. Predictably, this has led to an effect on the inhabitants of the world, and the constant beating down of mankind has trained human beings to accept and succumb to their situation. Over time, people have acquired a learned helplessness, and there's very little encouragement for the notion of making a life for oneself apart from menial tasks and misplaced worship. As a result of this, we have a very palpable sense of the characters in this story quote-unquote playing their roles, due to either cowardice or for the good of their fellow man. Of course, the people doing this might not necessarily agree with the behaviors that they promote, but they're just doing what they've learned is the only way to live. And this can lead to a relatability and a depth of character in this story, due to a duality founded from the dissonance between the outward masks that people in this story put on to play their roles, and what they truly feel. But this dualistic nature is not strictly limited to negative implications, and if it were, then the story would feel much less optimistic than it ended up being. There's a flip side to so many characters in Gurren Lagann, an inner depth or ulterior motive that not only adds to, but defines who these people are. The more somber examples of people who feel helpless but play their roles contribute to the audience's perception of how tyrannical a setting this is, while the more positive characters break the mold and spit in the faces of the doubters through their inner motivations, which form the thematic and emotional foundation for the story. Regardless of context, Gurren Lagann is absolutely filled with deep characterization, and a lot of that is because of the contrast and duality between what the characters act like and how they truly feel. There are at least two levels of characterization to the majority of characters in this series: the deceiving surface level consisting of the outward behaviors of our characters, and the deeper second layer consisting of the true reason behind those behaviors. And this second layer is everything in Gurren Lagann. Those in power in Gurren Lagann are justifiably viewed as tyrants by the limited perspective of the main characters. The anti-spirals are vilified by the cast for their beatdown of spiral beings. Lord Genome is literally treated as a villain for the first half of the show for his and his beastmen's destructive methods, and the village elders are spotlighted as overly paranoid, eccentric, and perhaps even insane chiefmen by Kamina and others for their unorthodox and seemingly needless preoccupation with keeping village populations down and restricting people to underground. But what becomes clear is that these oppressors are playing these roles that have been thrust onto them, not because they want to, but because they feel like they have to. And this is due mainly to the learned helplessness that I talked about earlier. Gurren Lagann is touted as a silly and crazy fun series, and it is, but I think that the darkness of the setting is overlooked at times. If you had been taught your whole life by people who had been taught by others their whole life that there is no way for mankind to rise in prominence in the world, then you would believe it and regard that fact with as much esteem as the fact that water is wet. Those in power may seem personally authoritarian on the surface, but they are simply playing the roles given to them that are needed to ensure that humans don't become extinct entirely, because they harbor no hope that there's another way. In particular, the anti-spirals, who are the most antagonistic group in the series, are given an extra dimension here. They were oppressive and fundamentally backwards in their ideals, but had a point that humanity would eat itself if this setting were to keep progressing, as illustrated with how Rossiu spun the government out of control. They justifiably worked to suppress spiral power to prevent the spiral nemesis, but failed to realize that spiral power itself was the most precious asset that humanity had. From the universe-wide rule of the anti-spirals to the minor leadership of the village chiefs, these people are simply doing what they must, even if they aren't necessarily seeing the bigger picture. In many cases, I'm sure there was internal agony on the part of the leaders who had to commit atrocious acts to preserve their race, but it must be stressed that the essence of these people is rooted in a pure care for man. The way this concept applies to these characters is one of the more obvious instances of the second layer in the plot, but it's one of the most powerful, and it really is thematically essential to the story, because it drives home the very metaphorical nature of the narrative through the point that the closest thing to a villain in Gurren Lagann is the idea that you can't achieve the seemingly impossible. For the sake of redundancy, I won't spend as much time on Rossiu as I did in my other video, but it must be said that his second layer truly makes him the bridge between the Watcher and the other oppressors. His actions of limiting the growth of the human race and sentencing Simon to death for the sake of order and prosperity were completely despicable and tragically misled, but episode 23 adds a much needed dimension to Rossiu. Through it, we see that not only was he doing all of this for what he perceived as humanity's benefit, but that it pained him to his absolute core. On the surface, Rossiu was a power-hungry tyrant who betrayed his friend in cold blood. But when we're given a deeper look, we see that he was completely selfless in his motives, as narrow-minded as they ended up being. Of course, this doesn't forgive his actions, but it gives him the potential as a character to make strides to redeem himself in the ways that he intended all along. And he gladly takes that route, showing his true colors in the end. Without the emotional context of Rossiu's arc, the internal struggles or motivations that take place within Lord Genome, the Anti-Spirals, and the village leaders would feel somewhat alien and detached. We would have been able to understand the situations thanks to some lines that we get from the characters, but not truly grasp the pain that some of them went through in playing their unwanted roles. But thanks to the psychological turmoil that Rossiu went through in naively trying to better humanity through his methods, we can truly sympathize with these characters, and their motivations become a much more personal and comprehensible concept. Rossiu gave us an inside look at the people that tried to maintain this world through stagnation, and this gives an element of dynamism and maturity to the series that really went a long way. Yoko is deceptive, especially to people who know about her but have never watched the show. On the absolute shallowest level, you could define Yoko as a kick-ass fanservice machine who's just tough, independent, no nonsense, and needs no one. But if you've watched the show, then you'd very quickly correct this presumption. Yoko sometimes acts as though she doesn't crave the attention or affection of others, but this is a paper-thin wall to break down before Yoko's true essence shines. She is very obviously someone who cares for people and values close connections, displayed through her feelings for Kamina, her adoration of Simon, her maternal nature that comes out near the end, her fantasy-induced dream involving Kitan, anything really. Having said that, Yoko's dualism mainly comes from her narrative role rather than her characterization. On the surface, Yoko adds personality and sex appeal to the story, but she's very much a character of strength, who provides balance and whose themes are communicated through. She's pretty intelligent and mature, willing to take action like Kamina, but only after thinking about whether or not the action is logical or beneficial, like early Simon or Rossiu, which balances out these characters who would seem like polar opposites. And while Simon was hit incredibly hard by Kamina's death, Yoko showed true maturity in the way that she dealt with it. She is a character who is constantly left in tragic positions, having two potentially romantic partners stolen from her shortly after professing their feelings for her. And through this we are given clear examples of the darker and somber themes in Gurren Lagann, of the sheer necessity of adapting from tragedy and persevering. I can't stress how self-assured Yoko is. She's able to pick herself up after being left face down in the dust, she's able to come to terms with and move on from her suffering alone, and most notably, she's able to understand her role in this world before anyone else really does. Her ability to realize that she had no desired place in modern civilization was one that Simon would eventually come to later in life, but one that she discovered years and years earlier. She provides an example for a type of person that humanity needs if it wants to flourish. Despite how larger than life she is, at the end of the day she decided to stand aside, provide a supportive role, and nurture the young minds of the future in order to stand the world in good stead. She represents a good portion of the realism in the story, which all contributes to my perception of her as a dualistic balancing tool in the story. To me, Yoko is an absolutely ideal support character, and a terrific personification of Gurren Lagann as a series. Fun, badass, and sexy, but incredibly mature at the same time. Kamina is everything in Gurren Lagann. He drove the narrative forward in the first act, planted the seed of determination in the protagonists that enabled them to make their stand at the end, and shaped the tonal structure and narrative trajectory of the story through how his death impacted the plot. Without Kamina, big themes in Gurren Lagann based in unyielding determination would seem shallow and maybe even immaterial. And this was all achieved by his characterization, which was so boldly yet intricately done that I consider what Gurren Lagann did with him in only 8 episodes to be something of a masterstroke. His surface-level characterization is a lot of what people tend to dislike him for. Kamina is cocky, hot-blooded, determined, and optimistic to the point of foolishness. I can completely understand why he might seem irritating to some due to his tendency to act on impulse, and his inclination to stupidly charge into battles that seem unwinnable. On this level, Kamina is very much a burly, sunglass-wearing representation of Gurren Lagann's themes of perseverance and self-confidence, and this impression takes up a great percentage of his lasting impact. But when we look a bit deeper, we can see that this outward behavior is not simply a result of true self-confidence or defiance to authority. It's much more. When he was a young boy, Kamina's father somehow reached the surface. He asked Kamina to come with him, but Kamina's fear of the unknown awaiting him in this new and foreign land meant that he didn't have the courage to follow. Instead of going on together, the two promised each other that they'd meet again someday. This promise, along with the inspiration of his father and what he represents, is a huge driving force behind Kamina's actions. He doesn't break through the surface just because he wants to defy authority. He does it because he wants to both fulfill his promise to his father and believe in his father's hope that there was a prosperous world out there. And after Kamina discovers that his father has died, his warring against the Beastmen was again not founded in simple rivalry or blind determination like it may seem, but in an ambition of providing humanity with a world that they didn't have to be afraid of, one that his father desired. Kamina truly cares for people, and expresses this care through protecting them and providing inspiration for them to do their best through his charisma. But the truth is, his ramblings, confidence, and charismatic actions are a simple front to cover up and compensate for the fact that he has insecurities and worries. In the past, Kamina and Simon's village had been caved in. Kamina did his usual thing by keeping everyone positive through his words, but it was Simon who was the true hero by continuously drilling through the rock to get everyone out. Moments like this inspired Kamina to never give up or show fear, and whenever he felt down, he remembered Simon's determination. To Kamina, the people like Simon are the real heroes. He gives them motivation and confidence, but they carry it through. Simon would not have been able to live without Kamina, but Kamina is truly telling the truth when he says that it's the other way around as well. They complete each other. And Kamina acknowledges this, using it to inspire others so that they can keep pushing when they may be lacking the confidence to do so. It's a very interesting and pretty touching sort of self-fulfilling prophecy at work here. While it may seem like Kamina being as inspirational as he was just a happy coincidence, the fact is that he is much more intelligent than people give him credit for. He knows the importance of his role and he embellishes it, but he's very acutely aware that he is playing this role to motivate others, and that without others, he would be alone and afraid. Kamina's deeper characterization can be easy to miss when looking at the broad picture of the story, but isolate him and his actions, and we see that he is intentionally everything that he needs to be to support his friends, in order to make up for his deficiencies. He wasn't just an angelic or ideological martyr. He was a flawed human being who grew and developed and taught others how to grow and develop. And that is a huge distinction that I think has to be made when it comes to Kamina. Nia finds herself to be the outlier in this story in basically as many ways as one can be distinguished in an anime. She has no knowledge of the dynamics of the ongoing conflict, she's the only character who didn't know Kamina, she even starkly stands out in terms of color scheme and character design. But most importantly, she's one of the only characters in this story without a dualistic nature. Nia is also the only primary character in this story that speaks exactly what's on her mind all the time. She is completely transparent, and although saying that she had a horrible childhood is a massive understatement, she hasn't been conditioned in any way to hide her feelings. I definitely would have bought it if she hid herself from the world, as the way she was discarded by Lord Genome could easily leave emotional scars, but you can always tell what's going on in Nia's head. Early story Simon, Viral, Kamina, Yoko, all of the oppressors, Rossyu, they all had internal feelings to one degree or another that tended to hide behind outward behaviors. But Nia is the opposite. Just observe the way that people around Nia act in shock and awe when she speaks her mind. She says the things that people tend to think but are afraid to say, and she speaks exactly how she's feeling. Her introduction into the story is a welcome breath of fresh air to lighten up the bleakness of the tone after Kamina's death, and this is achieved in part thanks to her lack of duality, which contrasts with so much of the rest of the show and helps her to stand out. VIII is one of the best examples throughout the story of the two levels of characterization, although his two levels are both pretty apparent from almost the offset, and the lines between the two layers become so blurred by the end that they're indistinguishable. Similarly to the way that humans across generations were conditioned to believe that mankind would never be able to live out of the shadows, VIII has spent his entire life being told that humans are primitive, naked ape scum. This much is clear from the beginning, but as soon as he comes into contact with humans for the first time, he begins to question things. Underneath the outward aggression, VIII secretly admires the tenacity and honesty of humans, and his surprisingly strong sense of honor distinguishes him from the common beastmen rabble. His thoughts stray into some existentialist territory as he wonders what the reason behind his purpose is, and he simultaneously begins weakening his irrational hatred for humanity, feeling a strange sort of emptiness upon hearing that Kamina has died. As the series progresses, VIII's outward role of being a humanity-hating beastman wanes until he decides to join Team Dai Gurren. And here we see the rawest, truest essence of VIII. He was a man that was born into a loveless group that just wants simple human connection that he had been starved of. He acts rough and disconnected on the exterior, but is clearer than ever that VIII thrives from being part of a group that loves and supports one another, united against a common cause. Here he is experiencing all of the emotional connections that he has subconsciously been jealous of, and it all comes together in episode 26, when we are shown the team's truest desires. I couldn't help but get chills in seeing that above all, what VIII wanted most was family. Of course, he dismisses this as a sappy dream and rejoins the fray immediately, but that doesn't eliminate what his base desires are. From the start, the two layers of VIII, the first one being his irrational detestment of mankind, and the second being his more questioning and sentimental nature, are segregated. But as his baseless hate for humanity diminishes, the two begin to merge as he questions the role of the beastman and his own existence. His deeper layer takes prominence as he joins Team Dai Gurren, completing a very interesting character arc. And his ability to accept the romanticized reality of a fictional wife and daughter as pure fantasy was a deceivingly important element of the story. Themes involved with being able to accept the limitations of reality may seem paradoxical in a story like Gurren Lagann, but believe me when I say that it is as significant of a narrative message as nearly everything else. Aside from the characters, Gurren Lagann is also completely rooted in dualism when it comes to its final messages with the series, where we find that the encouraging mantra of the story related to limitless personal potential is actually contrasted by the fact that death is a natural part of life. In an ending that has proven to be pretty controversial, Simon decides to forego the option to keep Nia alive. This ending is deemed by some to be inappropriate and inconsistent with the tone and messages of the series, but in examining the true essence of Gurren Lagann's depth, this couldn't be farther from the truth. Simon is aware of the anti-spiral's message, the warning that uninhibited progress for the human race would spell ruin. So he does not use spiral power to save Nia, because he's mature enough to realize the balance that the race must adhere to. And this maturity has been an underlying element of the story all along. In the end, Gurren Lagann preaches that life should be full of vibrant adventures and sticking it to the man and not letting yourself be oppressed. But it also preaches that life is finite, that death is an inevitability and a natural thing that we must all become used to. We saw Simon adapt to death throughout his character arc, and we see him use all that he's learned in the end to resist the temptation of bringing loved ones back. In one way, Simon has learned to laugh in the face of adversity, but in another, he has accepted the fragility of life. In contrasting the message celebrating how great it is to live life with reckless abandon, in its final scenes, Gurren Lagann is also very much a memento mori, a reminder that in the end, we must accept our mortality. That we can progress and strive for more, but not be unrealistic. And we should not fear this, but instead embrace it, and seize the fleeting moments of life that we have. When it comes to characters, themes, and the essence of the entire narrative itself, Gurren Lagann is all about this duality. The show finds a lot of its identity in its bombastic, colorful, and hot-blooded first layer, but is all the more substantial for the depth provided through its character-focused, motivation-driven, and mature second layer. The strengths of each layer are accentuated by the other, and each is made more influential due to the other's presence. I think that this is what I take from the narrative structure of Gurren Lagann the most, and why it sticks in the minds and hearts of so many who experience the story. This is definitely not a unique concept, and I'm not praising Gurren Lagann for simply implementing it. In fact, I've talked about this idea in several of my videos in the past with regards to other stories. But the setting-based chain effect that led to the dualistic nature of this story's characters, and the way that this depth satisfyingly contributed to the series' resolution really made it stand out to me. And it's yet another example of how Gurren Lagann is actually much less one-dimensional than people tend to give it credit for. Thanks for taking the time to watch this video, and I sincerely hope that you enjoyed.